This happened 3 years ago. We had decided to have a team-building exercise, and everybody agreed to go camping. The place where we need to camp is a vast clearing, and to reach it, we needed to walk through dense forest. I'm not a physically fit guy, so I was left behind, panting, but I could still see my workmates. After a few moments of walking, I received a message that we could rest for a bit, then continue on afterwards. At this point in time, I can't see them anymore, but I'm confident that I could easily follow them, due to the trail being visible even though the vegetation was quite lush. I just continued walking instead of resting, since I was adamant about wanting to catch up. A few moments had passed, but I didn't manage to catch up or even see them. I also feel like something was a bit off. I received another message from them that they were now moving. According to the person who suggested the place, it will take around 30 minutes of walking to reach it. I had walked for more than a half hour already. I noticed that the trees that I passed minutes before were the same as those that I'm passing right now. I decided to leave my bright orange pen on the side of the trail to serve as a marker and to make sure I'm not just seeing things. I walked for a few moments more. Fear swept through my body when I saw the pen that I had left behind me mere moments ago, just a few meters ahead of me. I tried to calm myself as much as I could, told myself to just make sure to walk straight because, back then, I might be walking in circles. I informed my workmates that I needed help. I continued on my way after that. I don't know if it's just because of fear or if it is something else. When I was there, everything just seemed so quiet, suspiciously quiet. I can't hear the leaves rustling or the birds chirping. All I could hear was my heart pounding and the steps that I was taking. I haven't walked that far, but once again, I saw the pen ahead of me. It took a shorter walk this time for me to reach it, even though my pace had not changed at all. I called for my workmates to look for much-needed help. They told me that some of them were coming back to help me. I started to walk the same trail while telling them about the pen that I had left. They advised me to simply continue following the path, and they were confused. There was no other way aside from it, wondering how I got lost. After all, getting lost on this path is nearly impossible. While I was talking with them at the time, they told me that they had found the pen, asking where I am. Now, I was left completely speechless. I asked myself why I don't see them, as if there was only one trail, and the pen was behind me. I began panicking. I even thought of going off trail in desperate attempt to find a way out of here. They told me to just stay where I was. They would continue to search for me. They even split up into 2 separate groups. The first one walked towards our campsite, while the remaining ones continued the search towards the entrance to the forest. It was already late afternoon, and there was still absolutely zero sign of them. So, I walked one last time towards the campsite. I nearly lost my mind when I saw the pen once again right on the spot where I'd left it. The trees are still the same. I went back to the same place all over again. I gave up at that point, decided to go back to the entrance of the forest where there's a cabin nearby that I could spend the night. I can't handle my fear and sheer exhaustion anymore. I don't know why the pen was still there, if my workmates had supposedly found it already. I was also too afraid to pick it up. After around 15 minutes of walking, I heard somebody calling my name. I rushed towards the sound, and finally managed to find my workmates. What I still can't understand to this day is that they're the ones who went back to the entrance of the forest while searching for me. They told me that they were heading towards the camp, which means that they should have passed me on their way to the entrance. Crippling fear had sent shivers down my spine. So I tried to be as calm as possible. They took my bag and assisted me towards the camping site. The whole time, I kept my eyes glued to the trail. I even recognized the trees, but The pen was not there anymore. I asked them about the pen that they had found and they gave it to me. I can't explain why I saw it once back then. We passed that point, and I was expecting that we would just come back. But after a few moments, we were already out of the forest. I sighed with great relief. I was not able to participate in any activities that night. I was still too afraid and tired. I did my best to try not to think too hard about what had just happened. In the middle of the night, I woke up, needing to pee. With my own 2 eyes, I see this figure with unnaturally long arms walking outside. Its shadow was cast on the side of the tent by the full moon. I counted everybody inside. There were 10 of us and only 10. Nobody was outside. Everybody was in their tents. I never dared to wake somebody up, with the fear that it might get the being's attention. I also don't have the courage to take a look to find out what it is. Just went away after some time. I did not manage to go back to sleep anymore. I just kept everything to myself after all. Nobody would believe me. After the team-building exercise, I never really recovered emotionally. I always feel stressed out and paranoid to the point that I can't even work properly anymore. Deciding to take some time for myself, I resigned. On my very last day, one of my workmates approached me and told me that she too saw it, the thing outside my tent. I always felt that incident on my way towards the camp was definitely linked to the being that we saw. I might never know the answers to my questions, but I would not want to get them either. I just want to forget everything and pretend that nothing happened at all. Sometimes in life, that's always easier. In October of 2009, when my family was visiting my cousins in their farmhouse, something weird had happened. None of us can explain it. None of us can prove it. And none of us can believe it, for the most part. The incident feels like a dream, a nightmare, but it happened. It happened many years ago. But to this day, I can't think of the it without getting goosebumps on a painful level. Here's some context. My uncle is an investment banker, and I dare say he's doing pretty well. The farmhouse they own is basically the size of a mansion, and the ranch surrounding it, spread over God knows how many acres. If you stand on the balcony, you can basically reenact that scene from Lion King. As kids, the farmhouse was our go-to place for every vacation. Even now, that all 4 of us, my sister Jenny, cousins Nicole and Max, and of course me, are basically adults. We used to meet up at the farmhouse at least once every year until last year. This is when my uncle sold the property off. We loved everything about the farm. It was away from the city. There was a lot of room to play all sorts of games in the house and in the fields. It had probably been explored by many people before, who had carved some pathways into the ground all throughout the forest. Everybody stayed on the ranch for weeks at a time. So, in the many years that we visited it, we explored a major portion of the outer woods, and in doing so, we knew the ins and outs of most of the pathways better than the backs of our own hands. Thanks to our many adventures, we had found a clearing about 200 meters in the forest, which served as a great sunset point. Well, we're not really allowed to stay in the forest till the evening, so we haven't actually seen the sun setting from there. But we called it the sunset point nonetheless. The 4 of us would often take our lunch with us and have little picnics in the sunset point. But the stipulation was we had to return home by 5 p.m., no later. Nicole, the eldest and bravest of all of us, used to argue pretty much every vacation with the adults, letting us watching the sunset from Sunset Point at least once. But our parents would always flat out say no. I couldn't understand why we could not stay in the forest past our curfew of 5 p.m., since there reportedly wasn't any big animals in there. But I obviously get it now. Paranormal or not, forests are creepy and dangerous and full of stuff you don't know and don't want to know. Now, if we fast forward to a long weekend in the winter of 2009, my parents, along with my uncle and aunt, had to go out of state to visit our grandparents for a day. After countless hours of begging and crying, they had reluctantly agreed to drop all of us off at the farmhouse if we promised not to stay out past our curfew or, burn the property down. I, the youngest of the four, was only 15 at the time. Nicole, being the eldest, was 17. Everybody just assumed we would be responsible for ourselves and make educated decisions. They were wrong. Obviously, the first decision we made was to finally see the setting sun from the sunset point, like we had always wanted. After the adults had departed, Max suggested we each pack a backpack, planning the adventure for the next day. He and Nicole stuffed their bags and snacks. Jenny packed a few games, and I packed some fruits, cards, and water, along with a flashlight and batteries, any other miscellaneous supplies we might need. The next day, having high hopes and extreme excitement, our adventure began. Now, our parents were supposed to come back by that afternoon of the next day with our grandparents. So this day was the only chance that we had had. We fooled around the entire day until roughly 5 p.m. when we left for the sunset point. We were there in about 20 minutes, playing some Uno for a while and sitting on the cool grass while the sun was still up in the sky. Finally, it was time. I munched on a Mars bar that Max had brought as we all saw the setting sun. It was beautiful. The sunset point had truly lived up to its name. After all this time, we had taken a bite from the forbidden fruit, and it was well worth it. Or so I thought. Because soon after, it began getting dark. Jenny had begun growing impatient and scared as we started to make our way back. So I popped out the torch. This was when the creepy things really began. The way back seemed way longer than it ever had before. The ground somehow felt wet to my shoes, even though it had neither rained nor it was that cold. Then, there were the noises. Oh God, the noises. Even the rustling of the bushes in the wind sounded like footsteps and whispers combined. It could have been footsteps and whispers, but I like to think that it was just the wind. We were all pretty scared and were hurrying back as quickly as possible. I was in the front of the pack with my own flashlight, walking quickly, when Jenny tapped on my shoulder, making me literally jump out of my skin. She slowly whispered into my ear, on the verge of tears, that she felt like we were being followed. To be honest, that thought terrified the crap out of me. But my sister was crying, and I wanted to do my best to assure her that we were safe. I stopped, and so did the others. Turning back, I moved everybody out of the way, pointing the flashlight towards the path we had just come from. "It's only the wind, Jen, relax," I had told her when it happened. All of a sudden, breaking up my sentence, I saw that in the light of the torch in front of us had formed the shadow of a man that was waving his right hand. There was none in front of me, yet there was on the ground in front of us, from the light of the torch, a shadow. I froze in horror. I had never been more scared. It felt like I had lost control of my entire body. I wanted to vomit my internal organs out. I was so scared. Instinctively, I took a step back, turning around. Everybody else was staring at the shadow, experiencing the very horror I was going through. Seeing my movement probably made them snap out of it, and we ran. We ran and cried and ran faster until we exited the forest, finally reaching the farmhouse. Thankfully, we were all together and nobody was lost. I don't remember what happened immediately after that, but all of us felt extremely sick for a few days. We did not tell our parents until recently, and of course, they refused to believe. I can't say I blame them. If I had the option, I would choose not to believe it either. It was the last time we ever went to the forest. I missed the adventures we had there. The forest had always been our fifth companion, but it makes me shudder to think that we might have had a fifth companion all along. Well, get this. Turns out one of the original owners of this farmhouse and the ranch had actually committed suicide by blowing his head off with a shotgun back in that same point, right where we would call Sunset Point. His body would not be recovered for months, and his date of death was due back in 1919, which only means one thing. We met the spirit or ghost of this long-lost man who owned that property. Here goes nothing, I guess. Okay, so this is the story of my first and last camping trip. I have never gone camping as a kid. It was just something that my parents never did and encouraged their kids to do. I was also never really a nature person. Having grown up a city slicker, my life revolved pretty much around only concrete and a few parks here and there. I learned to love these places. After all, they were my home. But I never spent too much time in nature, at least outside of my own bubble. Most of my friends were kids from my own neighborhood. We grew up together, in the same places I had just mentioned before. Flash forward to 3 years ago. I had turned 30. I wasn't feeling like having a party to celebrate. I was kind of getting tired of my old life and craved a change. But that's not the point in the story. One of my friends, whom we'll call Mark, had suggested we go camping over the weekend and go for something new. Now, I had met Mark in college. He was always the happy-go-lucky person, and my friend group embraced him immediately. He hasn't gone camping in a long time, but loved doing it. My other two childhood friends, we'll call them Steve and Jake, have not gone camping much at all, kind of like me, so it sounded like a really exciting idea. Mark would be our mentor in a way, and we'd get to spend some time away from all the noise and crowds of the city we live in. Mark took us shopping for gear. We'd bought two two-person tents, sleeping bags, and some more equipment. We packed our stuff on a Friday, heading north. The weather was nice. It was early September, so the daytime was always warm and sunny, the nights not being too cold because fall had not set in yet. They were mild. It seemed like the perfect time for some quiet time, away from the bustle and noise of city life. To drive to our destination was about 5 hours long. Mark was driving, and between regular banter and talking about our lives, he would talk us through where we were going and what our course of action was once we had arrived. The plan was to arrive at about 6 p.m., set up camp, and build a fire, so we could rest and keep warm for the rest of the evening. About 2 hours into our trip, we stopped at a gas station. We got some snacks and drinks for the rest of the road. All four of us left the car and stretched our legs for a bit, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Seems like the perfect description for the location of this gas station. It was on the right side of the road. We had just pulled in and got out. The place had some strange air around it. The clerk was the only person there. I half wondered who allowed this poor sickly man to work here all alone. He was also slow. Ringing our order took him around 10 minutes solid. I'm not kidding. And he kept staring at Mark, like really zoning in on him. So much so, it made all of us very uncomfortable, and Mark stepped outside and decided to wait for us in the car. The road we were on was far from busy. We'd only driven past maybe 4 or 5 cars, and none of them were in the same lane as us. We were in the only car that drove up north on that strip of road. I only mention this because, while Mark was waiting outside, a red truck had sped north, past the gas station. It was the only vehicle going in that direction we'd seen all day. The clerk registered the red truck as well, because his demeanor changed. He seemed taken aback and slightly confused. We managed to get what we wanted and left the gas station soon after. At around 6 p.m., as we initially planned, We arrived at the campsite. Mark was so excited for all of us to visit. And Mark taught us to set up our tents and prepare the place for a fire. We now needed some firewood. So, Mark and I went out to get some wood. It was peaceful and nice. I walked around a bit admiring all the scenery. I believe that it could have been a defining moment for me in starting a new life. A life that I had craved had it not been for the noise behind me. I still don't know how to describe it properly. It was loud but kind of muffled at the end. I called out Mark's name, but there was no answer. I turned around to look for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Mind you, this was not a very dense forest. Had he gone in any direction, I would be able to see him, and I had not. My back was turned to him for no more than 30 seconds. I even looked up into the trees as maybe he was trying to pull a prank on me and scare me. But no, he was just gone. I decided it was probably best to walk back to the camp and maybe see if Jake and Steve had seen Mark, but they insisted he had not returned before me. We waited for him for about an hour, getting increasingly scared by the minute. We'd gone through every scenario in our head of what could have possibly happened. Nothing made sense. I even contemplated walking out on the road and looking for help, but it was already dark and we did not want to risk anything else happening to the three of us, so we stayed together. Probably a smart move. It was not like we could just get help and leaving the site. We also did not feel brave enough to go out searching for him, so we stayed. It was probably about 10 p.m. at this point. The three of us were all crammed into one tent, when all of a sudden, another loud thud was heard about 50 feet away from us. We went outside, very confused, and see a delirious Mark stumbling towards us. He seemed physically unharmed, and once he came to, we asked him where he was and what had happened. He didn't seem to know the answer to any of our questions, so we let him rest, and left the campsite as soon as we felt he was well enough. I drove us back. The ride back was quiet. I sped past the gas station, and this time, the clerk was outside, and he stared at us. I never want to go back there again. On the car ride back, Mark explained to us a little more what happened, now that his memory was coming to. After I just turned around, he took a step and remembers this large, hairy object coming towards him. And the next thing he knew, he woke up in this animal den, or so he described. Bones everywhere, and the smell of blood was thick in the air. He heard growling and was terrified, immediately waking up and pulling himself up, running out of this small den that what he described was a small cave in which he could clearly see the opening. As he escaped, he felt delirious and drugged, as if he had been given some sort of sedative, is how he described the feeling. After wondering for what felt like hours, but was probably only a mile or two away from us, he found our campsite. He doesn't really remember much beyond that, but whatever he saw really scared him. And as far as I know, there's no animal out there that can take people the way it took Mark. Growing up in Jersey, I had of course heard of the Jersey Devil. I would be lying if I said that I always knew exactly what it was. Like with every legend, the story becomes twisted more and more as it's passed down generation to generation. When I had talked to my buddy Tony during school about going and staying the night in the pines, he laughed in my face, assuming this was some sort of a joke. After assuring him that I was dead serious, he put his hand on my shoulder and got really serious. "You're joking, right?" he asked, and I shook my head. "You seriously shouldn't go there, man. I've heard stories." Even the tone of his voice let me know this wasn't some sort of joke. He was genuinely scared. I wanted to ask him what type of stories, but the bell rang, and we were both making our way back to class. The day ended. I got into my car and drove to the pines. I kept my camping stuff in the back so I could go straight from school. It was daytime. I wasn't scared. And nothing scary happens during the daytime after all. I foolishly thought to myself. I got to my tent and sleeping bag and walked out through the pines. It was beautiful. I spent my whole life in New Jersey, and I never once got to experience this place. How can that be? I thought. A couple of hours have passed since I've set down my tent. I'm reading a book, enjoying myself. It's not yet nighttime, but the sun is definitely setting. Usually, I'd be too afraid to sleep out in the dark woods alone, but I bought some melatonin and pills, and I wouldn't be awake long enough to be scared. I reached into my bag to grab the pill bottle. I reached around and didn't feel it. After about a minute, I started freaking out. I emptied my whole bag and searched through the mess. No bottle. I sat back and chewed on my fingernails, something I haven't done since I was in elementary school. I kept thinking about what Tony had said, replaying his warning over and over in my head. I peeked my head to see how much sunlight I had left. Much to my surprise, the answer was none. It was darker than I had expected. I zipped my tent up and got under the blankets, knowing there was no chance I would be sleeping. I was under the cover when my eyes were closed for about an hour. I felt ashamed as I was cowering under the covers like a child. But Tony's fairy tales had gotten to me. I grabbed my book and thought I might as well get some reading. I went to turn on the portable lamp that I had, and that's when I heard a very distinct hissing noise. I froze in fear, cussing under my breath, beating myself up for forgetting my pills, but after it stopped for a bit, whatever reason, I thought it was smart to open up the tent and see whatever it was that was out there. Assuming it was gone, it wasn't. Thankfully, it was faced the opposite way. It looked almost as if it was looking for something out there. I opened up the tent door and crawled as quietly as possible. It didn't hear me, I suppose. He or it just kept looking out in the distance. As I got my leg out, I kicked one of the poles and my tent came toppling down. I quickly rolled and got myself behind one of the many trees close to me. I heard him approaching the tent. I heard the footsteps and the hissing. I slapped my hand in my mouth. I didn't realize now how loud I was breathing, but it must have been right next to my ear. In front of the tree, I heard hissing, accompanied by what I assumed to be sniffling. The hissing was interrupted by my phone going off. Before anything else could happen, I got up and took off running, before I would become the next meal, making some noise, but I didn't think it had heard me over the sound of my alarm. Maybe it did, but just did not care. I felt like I ran for several minutes before bumping into two guys who were wearing hunting outfits. They laughed at my franticness, asked me what was wrong. They even had southern accents. They weren't from around here. I responded, "Who's out there? I saw it." They responded that it was the Jersey Devil. The hissing. The hunters looked at each other and walked off into the trees. I closed my eyes and tried to stop my heart from beating out of my chest. I just sat there alone for 10 minutes, trying to think of what to do next. I hadn't heard of anything, and I began to think, could I have possibly just made this all up in my mind? Have I lost my mind? Did I create a monster out of fear? I was assured that it was real when I heard a gunshot go off, and within seconds, another one. I smiled. They got it, I assumed. My smile soon faded, and I had heard a loud scream coming from beyond the trees. I closed my eyes and clutched the locket I was wearing around my neck. Then again, distinctly, I heard the hissing. I turned around, not bothering to see what was in front of me, and I took off running again as fast as I could, climbing up the trail to get back to where my car was parked, opening the door, getting in. I put the keys in and sped out all the way. I got home, saw my mother there, surprised to see me home. I ran to her, gave her a hug and was happy to see her, and needless to say, I never went camping again after this. I can only assume that what I saw out there was indeed the Jersey Devil, but it's hard for me to say. My name is Andrew. Some days ago, I was camping with my girlfriend and another couple at a mountain park located in Canada. Melissa was talking with Shirley while they were preparing the meal. Matt came with me to take some wood to build a campfire near our tents. We needed to use our small hatchets to cut up some wood and take the opportunity to gather some food for everybody. Matt had asked me if I had any previous experience with camping, and if I knew how to make a fire with a light or matchsticks. I told him no. It could not be that difficult. We kept cutting wood and kindling. The afternoon was nearly over. Our bags were full, and we went back to meet the girls. While we were walking, we all heard screams and calls for help, so we decided to see what had happened. For our luck, the sounds were not coming from where the girls were. We arrived, and the sunset had turned the scene even more terrible. We saw an entire family being devoured and torn apart by wolves. The mother completely disfigured. The father's body was shattered, and the boy and girl, I don't even want to say it. Matt was paralyzed with fear in his eyes, and I slapped his face, told him to get out without making any noise. When we had arrived at our camping site, we told the girls what we saw. They got scared, and here's where things change. Those wolves that we saw were not normal wolves. They were giant, bipedal, and looked completely vicious and ready to tear apart anything. They looked to be wolf hybrids, part man, part wolf, as crazy as that may sound. Upon telling the girls this, they believed us and were not quick to detest what we had to say. They panicked, telling us it was probably best we should leave. We knew we were not welcome in this park. We had to leave now. We could hear the howling off in the distance, and it sounded much louder and much deeper than any wolf we'd ever heard. Now all of us were panicking, breathing heavily, waiting for anything to happen. And of course, it was already very dark out. We did not want to be stuck out in the woods this night with those wolf things, or whatever they were. After trying our best to conceal our cries, we had found a small cavern where we would hide out and make our way until morning light. We figured that would be safest. I explained to my friends this is probably the only way to really survive the night. We entered. It was a very small little cavern. I think we all fell asleep after sheer exhaustion. In the morning, when we had awoken, there was a small amount of daylight peeking in. We all exited and tried to make our way back. Now we were lost, and we could not for the life of us remember where our original campsite was, let alone where we had entered through the park. In fact, it was like we had entered a completely different park. The surroundings around us looked completely different, foreign to us in every way, from the trees to the background and scenery, and now we were really beginning to panic. Fortunately, we were able to find some park rangers, but as it turns out, we were nowhere near Canada. We were actually down in lower Wisconsin, in the United States. We thought he was pranking us, making jokes, but when we spoke to him, he seemed very confused by our accents, and even confused that we kept mentioning where we had come from. How it was not possible that we were up in Canada camping, and now all of a sudden down here in the United States, southern Wisconsin. None of this really made sense. All we knew was that we had somehow fallen asleep in the small cavern to escape whatever these wolf things were, and the next thing you know, we wake up and we're now in a completely different state and country altogether. How this is possible, I don't know. It defies all science and laws of physics. I don't think the park ranger truly believed us, because he thought we were acting strange and probably thought we were all on drugs. After several weeks, we managed to get home, but it was very, very rough. Looking back, I feel like I had been in an episode of The Twilight Zone. I don't know how else to explain that we had transported somehow miraculously from one state to the other. None of it makes sense. And sometimes, maybe I reflect back and think we all had some mass hallucination, or potentially, it was maybe just a group nightmare or a dream. This story happened when I was around 9 or 10 years old. I used to go camping a lot with my youngest aunt and my cousin. She's only 8 years older than me, and my cousin is 4 years older than I am. Let's call them Anna and Martin. No, those are not their real names. Long story short, my mom is from Argentina, and so when I was a kid, my dad, she and I would travel to visit her family once a year. They have a farm in the outskirts of a town, and I'd frequently be allowed to play outside, as long as there was adult supervision. Like, there were dogs, horses, and chickens. I remember it to be pretty harmless and hot. We'd spend Christmas and New Year's Eve there. Summer. The thing is, not all my cousins liked me for being a city girl and a foreigner, so I got along better with Anna and Martin, since they were responsible. My parents, especially my mother, didn't mind me following them around. We'd walk around the country followed by dogs, watch movies, or camp outside, but always inside the farm limits, and never too close to the borders. The area is close to a national park reserve, so it has a lot of camping sites for tourists and all of that. The thing is, I vaguely remember my family telling us to be careful. Like, it's so close to the national border with Brazil, and like many zones where there are borders between countries, there were stories about narcos, gun trafficking, missing women and children. So, one night, Anna and Martin asked Mom and Dad if they could take me along to a camping site with the neighbor kids. They didn't want it at first, but one of the parents, a Brazilian lady, convinced them that they'd always look out for us. We drive to the camping site, but it wasn't legal camping. Like, they took us in the car to the middle of nowhere. They brought their dog along. I noticed something was off, but since Anna and Martin didn't say a thing, I just followed along. It wasn't like the neighbors looked suspicious. In fact, we spent the whole afternoon helping set up the campsite, learning about cooking stuff and complaining about the mosquitoes. Dengue fever is something ugly there, and listening to the parents' tales. Normal camping stuff. The creepy stuff at night. The parents had 2 tents and divided us, so the mom would sleep with us, girls, and the dad with the boys. They did not want us to be scared. Sleeping time was more like chatting time, until we fell asleep without noticing it. I was awoken by slurring voices. I remember being all disorientated, trying to get up and help Anna signaling me to stay quiet. When Aunt Anna tells you to be quiet, you just obeyed her. The other girl, she was younger than me, was also told to be quiet. So, it was dark and hot, in the middle of the jungle. And then I heard the dog whining, barking desperately. Weird noises against the stuff we had left packed. Something was walking around, throwing our things around and breaking plastic bottles and packages. I was scared. Even if it was some animal, we were defenseless. There were tales about jaguars attacking dumb travelers. It was obvious that our camping site was being invaded by some animal searching for food, attracted by the smell. We had just stayed quiet. Like, the adults don't do a thing, we couldn't know if the boys were awake. I just followed what the adults had told me. And then, I'll never forget this in my life. I swear, we all saw this weird silhouette projected against the tent's material. It was not a large cat like we thought. Some freaky thing crawling on all fours, its elbows and knees, or whatever they were, oddly twisted and vaguely human-looking. The body proportions were strange. It was thick, and the body's members seemed rather short. It had round ears. Its face vaguely reminded me of a cat. The dog began barking viciously, and I suppose it was a boy I think, didn't like it at all when the thing approached the tent. The next thing was that we had all heard was Dad yelling angrily, the boys left their tents, and strange yelling noises from whatever the heck that was crawling towards us. The mom then leaves our tent. So does Anna, and I follow immediately with the girl. There was no way we'd stay alone inside the tent after all of that. The adults spoke amongst themselves. They all decided it'd be better to just return. We'd hear noises in the trees, and we didn't like it at all. Something weird was there. The dad said he'd always camped there and nothing ever happened to him and his friends, until that moment. Like the curious brats we were, we began to press him and tell us what he saw. Same with Martin and the son. There was this mix of fear and morbid fascination, I can't even begin to explain it. Like, something was so ugly and shady that you just could not move your attention towards something else. All we got from him was that it was not a jaguar, but something else. Martin was pale and serious. The adults were occupied with packing up the stuff, calming the dog and making sure the youngest child did not run off. She wasn't an idiot. We didn't talk much about the event in the immediate moments. The parents were very serious, and I'm very sure the dad probably told the mom something they didn't want us to hear. Like, I saw and heard it. It wasn't human, nor common animal. And boy, at that moment, I was paralyzed. My head could not fully process it until later. And so, they drove us to their house. We returned to my grandma's home next morning. It was nighttime when we left the camping site. I remember Anna and Martin talking. Apparently, the creature had black spots, but it was not a jaguar. That thing wasn't a normal animal. No animals crawl like that, and it definitely was not a person. Everybody got surprised, and my dad was slightly mad. The only one who was surprised but not angry was my grandma. Apparently, local folklore talks about a jaguar-like man, or a werewolf kind of figure. My mother remembers the name. She'd hear stories about it when she was a kid, especially to scare kids into not going out at night. Some shaman that morphs into an animal and eats people. Half jaguar, half man, just kind of like a Native American werewolf. According to Grandma, dead chickens and dogs and other animals brutally killed and found by farmers would be attributed to this creature. Whatever it was, I thank luck for the commotion. The neighbors who brought us home instead of spending the night at the camping site. Something very shady was crawling around us. The dad was crazy, taking us to some cooler place. Please, if you decide to go camping, be careful. Go to safe areas. You'll never know for sure what you will encounter. This is a story that I had heard from my grandfather when I visited during my summer vacation. I'm in high school, and together with a best friend of mine, we visited my grandfather, who lives in a small village in the Philippines. This was the first time we had came here. The village was located in a secluded area near a small mountain, surrounded by a grove of trees. The houses were far apart, lots of grassy land. My grandfather also lives alone in a cabin-like house. One night, after dinner, my friend and I wanted to go outside to look for a better reception. There was no Wi-Fi in this remote place, but earlier in the morning, the signal was strong, just like we were connected to a Wi-Fi. As we were about to head out, my grandfather shouted at us, telling us to stay inside. We were quite spooked. He always kind of had this expression. After a moment, he explained that it was dangerous to head outside during the night. He said people had been missing. I asked him why. He said, the Maligno. Around here, these beings are malevolent spirits who live in mounds or old trees or even big rocks. In the Philippines, they are also known as a common myth. I have never seen these things, so I don't believe him. I thought it's most likely that these missing people were kidnapped by some other people, and not by some spirits. Seeing that we don't believe, he beckoned us to sit on the wooden couch. he sat in front of us and slowly told us a story, which sent shivers down my spine. Grandfather claimed that just a few years ago, when he was young, he had almost got abducted by a Maligno. He was 23 years young when he and a couple of his friends decided to head to the mountain near the village to camp. They had been doing this annually, so they were pretty familiar with the area and terrain of the mountain. They arrived at their camping spot, which they used every time. There was a small bamboo shed built in the area after settling down. This is when they decided to explore. They discovered these 3 mounds that which weren't there before. Grandfather and his friends believed in superstition, so they didn't bother with the mounds, believing the Maligno was residing in them. But not all of them. Grandfather told us that he had a friend, Danny, who didn't believe in those things, decided to poke around the mound with a stick. Not content, Danny decided to step and jump on it to prove a point. There's no such thing as a Maligno. Grandfather said that he and the rest ran back to the cabin, followed shortly by Danny. They returned back to the camp, still talking about what his friend did. That night, as they were sleeping, they hear this unnatural sound as if a high frequency had been emitted from a broken radio. It was loud, which woke all of them up. Noticing that sound came from outside, they got scared. But that wasn't the scariest part, he had claimed. He said they could not move or even make a sound, and he still remembered the moment he was looking at Danny's eyes. He could see that Danny's lips were shaking as if struggling to open his mouth. The gas lamp that they were using began to flicker, and eventually, the fire was extinguished. Grandfather said that it was this moment his heart was beating so fast he could feel it all over his body. The door of the shed then suddenly opened. The door was locked from the inside, but it opened without any resistance. Then, weird noises were heard from multiple unnatural sounds. He heard footsteps. He felt legs get grabbed by something. He said it did not feel like hands. It felt like giant vines wrapping around his ankles, and he slowly dragged his face down. He was so scared, he felt like fainting. His face brushed up against the ground, but could not feel a thing. After a while of being dragged, they stopped, and the weird noises sounded again. This time, Danny's squeal was also heard. Danny sounded like a pig being slaughtered. That was the very last thing he remembered. The next moment, he woke up. It turns out he was dragged a few meters away from the shed. He said that after waking up, he felt a strong hangover and vomiting. He and his friends talked about everything that had happened, confirmed that everything was indeed real. He looked for Danny, but none of them saw him. After remembering everything, they concluded that Danny was taken by the Maligno. After they got back, they informed the other villagers. Grandfather said Danny's parents offered gifts, clothes, and alcohol to the Maligno and asked them to give their son back, but their requests were ignored. Grandfather looked at us and said the same thing now is happening at that village. There were 3 mounds just a few kilometers away. If they followed a road, it would lead them to it. Apparently, there were some children that played near it, destroying one of the mounds. The Malignos are still looking for the ones responsible. The next morning, my friend and I decided to follow the road Grandpa told us about, and there we saw it. In the middle of a grassy plain, 3 big earth mounds were placed, marking almost a perfect triangle, and one of the mounds was tilted and looked eroded. The mounds were clean in the sense that there was no moss or small grass growing on it. There was also a perfect circle in which the surrounding grass was clearly and cleanly trimmed, being maintained somehow. We took a picture, and suddenly our phones began glitching, and this high-pitched ringing sounded. We were spooked, and even when we were back at Grandpa's place, our hearts were still racing. We did not sleep well that night, and the very next day, we decided to go back home. After thinking about it for a long time, it is likely that this was an alien and not some evil spirit. But I would love to hear your opinion. What do you think? This happened last year. It was April, and me and my friends decided to take a camping trip to the nearby mountains. The forest on the mountain is a popular destination for groups to get together. As we had nothing to do for school that weekend, our plan was to stay the night. 6 of us were going. We planned it pretty quickly, and I was very excited to go. I had not gone on a trip in a while. I packed way too many things for just one night, but I didn't know what I would want to wear, or how cold it could get during the night. So it was okay. After we all got ready and met at the station, we set off at about 3 p.m. This way, we could get there by 4 and set everything up for the trip. We took 2 cars and brought 3 average-sized tents. This way, 2 people would sleep in every tent. We got to the mountain on time, left our cars at the end of the road, and walked for about a mile into the woods before finally settling on a good spot. We set up our tents, built a fire, put up some lights. It was now beginning to get darker. The atmosphere was amazing. We messed around some and even got drunk, then played Truth or Dare. And finally, at around 10 p.m., my friend Jeremy suggested we tell some scary stories. Amy and I were the only girls, and I was the only one who was against it. I easily get scared, but due to peer pressure, I went along with it. After all, there was probably nothing to be scared about, especially in a group setting. While Jeremy was telling us his scary paranormal story, I could have sworn I'd heard something breaking in the woods. I looked behind me, but nothing was there. When they asked me what was wrong, I brushed it off. Somebody else probably heard it as well. I wasn't really into the scary stories, and I definitely imagined something. I didn't want to be paranoid. There was this guy, Jacob. None of us really knew him. He was Jeremy's cousin, and he brought him with us so he would not get bored with his family back home. He actually was really cute, and me and Amy were both kind of flirting with him with any chance we got. Unexpectedly, he asked me to help him set up the blankets in the tent. He probably noticed that I was uncomfortable listening to their scary stories. I kind of thought he liked Amy more. They were constantly talking to one another, but I could not wait to get away, and the guy was hot, so I jumped at the chance to be alone with him. It was a 2 birds with 1 stone kind of situation. When we got to his tent, I couldn't be happier. It was all set up, which meant he was just making an excuse to be alone with me. He told me that he noticed I wasn't enjoying the atmosphere, and I seemed really nice, so he wanted to go somewhere more private. The tent wasn't really private, as it was just a few meters away from everybody else, so we agreed to take a walk. It seemed like a great idea, as we would get to know each other, probably come back once they finished telling all these stories. We let everybody know we would be back soon. When I looked at Amy, she just winked at me and smirked. Talking to Jacob was really relaxing, and he seemed very intelligent. He told me about his college, asked me if I had a boyfriend. I told him that I had not. So I was very happy when he told me he didn't have a girlfriend either. Soon, he kissed me and things would escalate quickly. I had not stopped and told him I was cold and that we should probably go back to the tent. No matter how much I liked this guy, I was a little bit drunk, and I just met him. So I couldn't let things change or go any further. He agreed that we should get back, but asked me if I wanted to switch tents so I could stay with him and get to know each other more. When we got to the tent, he asked me if I wanted to leave to go to his apartment. I was uncomfortable doing anything there. Now, this kind of creeped me out. It was midnight, and we were literally in the middle of nowhere. But I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I pretended that Amy wasn't comfortable sleeping with anybody else, and I had to go back to my tent. So I went to my tent and told Amy what he said. She agreed that it was really creepy. We didn't try to make anything out of it, though. Amy went to sleep, and I stayed on my phone for a bit when I heard somebody outside my tent. It was Jacob. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to stay here and not in his tent. I assured him that I was. He just stared at me for a minute with this creepy grin on his face, then said okay and just left. I didn't even know what to make of it, so I tried to go to sleep. Well, a few days later, I had really bad herpes. I went to the doctor to get it checked out. The first doctor asked me if anybody in my family or around me died recently. I said no. The last death in my family was 10 years ago when my grandmother passed. Then, he asked me if I had kissed anybody recently. I remember Jeremy's friend Jacob was basically the only person I even made out with in the past 4 months. He asked for his full name, but I didn't know it. I told the doctor I could find out for him. I was confused. He was probably sick or something and transferred it to me, but I didn't know why he needed his name. 2 officers showed up and began asking me about the guy, but I just gave them Jeremy's number, as I really knew nothing about him. I had no clue what all the fuss was about, and the doctor told me to just go home and buy some cream. The next day, I asked Jeremy about it at school. What he told me has left me shaken to this day. The herpes that I had was a very rare kind, transmitted by the bacteria in a decomposing body. The doctor recognized it right away and sent police to Jacob's apartment to see if there was anything there, as he was the only one I had kissed. When they got there, they discovered a dead girl's body. She had been missing for 3 weeks. No one knew where she was, and no one suspected Jacob because they didn't know each other. I couldn't believe what I had heard, and to think I could have been in her place, and I had gone with him to the apartment that night. I thank God for my common sense and morals every day since then. Creepy guy Jacob, let's not meet again. A few months ago, I decided to go camping with my family. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for quite a while, but our parents' busy schedule had made us cancel our plans time and time again. My siblings and I had almost given up until my father told us we would be having a camping trip over the weekend. My siblings and I were thrilled, to say the least. They had been looking forward to this trip for a very long time. Mom and Dad had planned the campsite. They had marked a spot that would be perfect. We all looked forward to the weekend, and we all shouted in ecstasy as the week had now ended. Late Friday afternoon, we're on our way. I was more composed compared to my siblings. They were so hyper that Mom had to threaten them before they could even stop their noises. After a 30-minute drive, we get to the campsite. It was a location close to the woods. The scenery was perfect. The atmosphere, amazing. While I admired everything around me, I had a slight discomforting feeling about the woods. It was like I could feel this presence lingering. It was ghostly and gave me the chills. I just shook my head lightly and pushed the thoughts out of my mind, blaming it on simply paranoia. We get out our camping gear, and I arrange them. I helped my father set up the tents, while my siblings helped Mother bring out things from the car. A little while later, everything was set up and our camping was now underway. It was dark by the time we were done, so we huddled together by a fire, as now it was a bit chilly. My mother served us some snacks that she had brought along. Everybody munched away. My siblings requested to hear some scary stories, as if on reflex. My mind went back to the presence I'd felt earlier in the day, and once again, a chill running through me, making me shiver. I wanted to stop my dad and tell him it was a bad idea, but ultimately, I chose not to say anything. Father and Mother had told their share of ghost stories, spooking my siblings so much, it took a bit of effort to get them into bed. A few minutes go by, and I moved a bit deeper into the woods to take a leak. I had drunk too much water. I grabbed the light, heading off into the woods to relieve myself. After walking what I consider a considerable distance, I squatted down to pee, and I felt this sensation all around me, like someone or something was watching me. This time around, though, the chill I felt was now bone deep. Unlike before when we had just arrived, that was only skin deep. It felt like someone had poured a bucket of ice-cold water all over my body. I turned around to look, and to my surprise, found no one. I turned to face front, and I saw it, standing in front of me. I was rooted to the spot. I didn't know if this was caused by fear or shock. I had no idea. I didn't know what to call it. It was not human. That much was certain. I let out a scream, and the last thing that I remembered was seeing bright lights before losing consciousness. I woke up, finding myself in a bright room strapped to a chair. I was surrounded by machines and devices. It was at this point that it hit me. I'd been abducted. While I was struggling to get out of my constraints, one of these things came in. It looked at me curiously and touched my face. Its hands were like ice, and every second it made contact with my skin, it was like chills going through my body. It was the result of this thing. It then moved towards one of the computers and did something to it. This thing was making all sorts of strange noises, and they were almost speaking to each other in this telepathic language I could not understand. Electricity began violently going through my body. After a while, the shocking stopped, but my body felt numb. It felt like the sensation of being pricked by 1,000 needles at once. Turning back to move in my direction, I saw these expressionless faces just gawking at me. The feeling of terror overcoming me, as more intense pain coursing through my body. I felt like my mind was going to be torn apart. After a few minutes that had felt like an eternity, while enduring this hellish pain, I was put through what I consider several more tests before it shook its head and stepped out of the room. Or so, that's what I would describe that it did. A few minutes later, it came in with others and also had the same expressionless face the others did. They all looked at me and began to communicate telepathically again. I know, because every time they did, I could hear it. It was like a room conversation in which I could hear through my mind, but it was a strange language I did not understand. I lost consciousness yet again, waking up at our campsite, where I had the protection of my parents. To my surprise, our trip was concluded. It was Sunday afternoon. I'd been gone for almost 2 days. With trepidation, I recounted my ordeal to my parents, but to my surprise, they laughed at me and told me I did not go anywhere. I was present all through the camping. They both noticed I was a bit absent-minded and behaved more mechanically, or so. Except for my absent-mindedness, I was present through everything. So, they believed that my tale of aliens being abducted, and of course, was discounted as a lie. They found it hard to believe. Of course, they too did not believe in the existence of aliens or any extraterrestrial beings whatsoever, even the paranormal. Despite all they said, and everything that I experienced, I'm certain that what I endured was real. So, about 4 years ago, I went on summer camp with my best friend Julie. I was only 13 at the time, happy to get away from home for a couple of weeks. It was very much needed. It was the first camp I had ever attended, and I only decided to go because I had Julie by my side. I was also very shy back then, so making new friends was not easy for me. The first few days at camp went pretty well. During a hike in the forest, Julie tripped over something and broke her ankle. Her dad had to pick her up the day after. I was left there by myself. I called my mother to ask her to come pick me up. I didn't have any friends there to talk to and hang out with. She thought being forced to make new friends would be great for my self-esteem. I had been sharing a tent with Julie, so I had to sleep by myself when she left. It was pretty scary alone at night, though, I'm not gonna lie. I constantly heard sounds coming from all around me. It was never really quiet. After 3 to 4 nights of sleeping alone, I got used to all the noise and found myself falling asleep after a couple of moments. This one night, I woke up to the sound of something walking around my campsite. The footsteps were heavy, but very slow. I assumed it was one of the male camp counselors since he was a bit on the heavier set side, but I still remember feeling somewhat uncomfortable and scared. I decided to stay awake until the person walking around went back to their tent, or wherever they came from. But they didn't. I could hear them walking around for over an hour. At one point, I just eventually fell asleep. I woke up after what felt like a couple of seconds. 2 loud footsteps coming towards my tent very fast. It sounded as if somebody was running towards me. I sat up, expecting to see the silhouette of a person appearing outside my tent. The footsteps stopping abruptly right in front of it. But I didn't see anybody. It freaked me out. Just imagine hearing somebody run towards you at high speed, to then not see anyone anymore. The worst part is, after the footsteps came to a stop, I did not hear the person walk off. For the rest of the night, I felt as if somebody was standing right in front of my tent, just watching me. I could never shake the feeling. I didn't sleep well for the rest of that night, and I could not move at all. I was petrified of making any noise to alert whoever or whatever could possibly be out there. In the morning, when I had heard everybody waking up and getting out of their tents, I finally felt like I could move again. I had immediately asked my camp counselor if I could be moved to another tent. I didn't feel safe enough to get through another night, not by myself. I never went on another camping trip for a little while, and I still blame Julie for this horrible experience, although I never told her about it. I will never go camping. No one can change my mind about that. After that night, I told myself I would never sleep in the cabin, because that night changed my life. I remember it like it was yesterday. My friends said we should go, and at first, I was a little put off with going and had fear with the bugs. They said if you don't like it, we can always go back home. I agreed, and they picked me up the following morning. As we were traveling, Mary, my friend, forgot her wallet, so we had to turn around and go all the way back to her house. We finally got her wallet and headed for the liquor store. After going to the store, we got gas and then finally headed to the cabin. We began drinking and singing, having a good old time. We stopped to stretch and see a weird light from the sky, flashing a strange light. My friend thought we were going crazy and the liquor was hitting. Maybe this liquor was laced. This lady gave us a tour and rules of the cabin. She claimed that if we didn't follow the rules, someone will come and haunt each and every one of us soon. We looked at each other and laughed. Clearly, she was messing with us. She said you will regret it later, and at night, we'd heard a loud scream. We thought it was just Mary messing with us. Then, we hear a loud bang and kids playing around. Our friends like to joke around and play pranks. I thought it was her playing sick games with us. I called out for her. I did not hear her respond. She was nowhere to be found. So Claudia, Ari, Jess, and Jamie were all looking around, but they could not locate Mary or where the scream came from. They went out with flashlights and went deeper into the woods. They lost signal and had no working lights at all. All of a sudden, all of our flashlights died in unison, and it was now getting late, which they thought it would be a great idea to split up and look for Mary. What a bad idea was that next, we had lost our way and had no way of getting back. 1 minute, Claudia was next to me. The next minute, she was gone. And Jess said that this is why I did not want to go camping. I knew something bad was going to happen. Look how 2 of our friends went missing. Do you think the lady that gave us the tours is trying to mess with us? Or maybe try and scare us? Arya said, well, whatever her problem is, she needs help. We did not do anything wrong, and this crazy old lady is out to get us. When Arya said that, something shattered the glass and began to choke her. We all tried to stop it, but the scary thing is, we could not see it. We did not know what to target. Jamie said to call the police, and we are in major danger. What are we going to tell them? If we tell them what we saw, they might help. No, they will think we're all crazy like this old lady that is trying to scare us. When Jamie said that, whatever it is in the house got very angry and began to attack Jamie. We tried to save him, but whatever got him was way stronger than all of us put together, and we see Claudia with their eyes cut out and their bodies cut into demonic sayings. It was a whole bunch of cut up dead people in the river. We could not believe our eyes. We had to make a run for it and head to the car, but by the time we got there, we had run out of gas. Everything was going wrong. We lost 2 good friends, and all because we laughed at that old witch. She had sent us her demonic task force. I can say with all my heart that I will never go camping to that cabin again. With there only being 2 of us left, we tried to search for clues and see why this woman was so terrible. It was like we were being spied on, and in that moment, we all heard this strange demonic voice. I said, Jamie, it's okay. Jess, I am here. He said, I don't know who you are. I want nothing to do with you. We began looking, and we found some books that truly gave us insight onto who she is and why all of this was going on. It turns out she was abducted, and the person that abducted her turned her evil. This guy makes her torture and hurt others. It was like we were being spied on because the moment we read that, my friend said you can't stop in this weird demonic voice. I said, Jamie, it's okay. It's Jess. I'm here. He said, I don't know who you are. I want nothing to do with you. We knew from the beginning all along, so we will do everything to stop you from setting other people free. They are coming for you, and they have powerful weapons that will knock you out, so you can be commanded on what to do. The demonic army will rise up, and we will not be defeated if you do not bow down. You will try and kill yourself, because the wrath of that is coming. They will come and haunt all that is left of you. Choose wisely. You only live once, but don't wind up like your friends dead and nowhere. Before I could even respond, a whole army of bees and wasps came to surround me. These bees were nothing like normal bees are. They were demonic. They stung me, and I bled, and I eventually passed out. I woke up in the hospital, surrounded by police and investigators. They wanted to know everything of what we had seen, and who was lost out of our friend group. The 2 of my friends who went missing were reportedly found dead, just as we had seen. We were going to be continually questioned and under investigation until this whole thing was cleared away. That's about all I can share with you for now. The investigation is still ongoing. A friend of mine said I should post this here, so here I am, posting it. Personally, I don't see the point. People are going to read this and think, yeah, right. I'm going to seem like the lunatic here, which is annoying, but if we're being honest, either way, here we go. It all began late last summer because Louis wanted to go camping. He caught his girlfriend in bed with another man, insisted that everybody had to come camping with him. It helped him focus on what was important. So, because we're all such great friends, we agree, which, in hindsight, a terrible idea. The day was overcast and muggy. The trail he was leading us down was overgrown with trees whose branches seemed to be tangled together. If I had known that Louis had never been down that trail before, I'd probably have spent less time drinking and more time tagging low-hanging branches. If I hadn't drank so much, I'd have noticed how quiet everything was. Usually, the forest was all scurrying and crunching leaves, crickets and bubbling creeks. But this forest was devoid of all such noises. The deeper we walked along the trail, the more the sound of our footsteps seemed to be swallowed up by the grass. Connor was the first to look uncomfortable. He had his arms wrapped around himself, like he was holding himself, and his eyes darted from branch to branch, like he'd find something within the clusters of woods and leaves. He was the first to question Lewis, asking him, "Where are we?" Lewis had told him we'd passed by this ugly rock 3 times, and then Hunter joined in. Those two were always ganging up on him, so it was really easy to ignore. After all, there was no way Hunter was still sober enough to take the nuances in rocks in a forest. The forest was full of them. If we had paid him a moment of attention, he'd be claiming that we'd passed a certain tree a while ago too. Seriously, Hunter had dug his heels, making a scene as always, and pointed at a rock that looked more like a boulder. It was about 4 feet away, tall and lumpy, covered in faded chalk like etchings that sent ice down my spine. The feelings of inconvenience and irritation faded pretty quickly as the feeling of being watched multiplied. As luck would have it, the sun was already going down, and I was seriously regretting leaving my house. The eerie quiet of the forest, the very noiseless phenomenon that I'd been happy to ignore earlier, was now making my dull instincts pulse with the need to run. "We should go, Lewis," I had said. But he rolled his eyes, sat down his backpack, and began unpacking. "If you're tired, you could say that." I couldn't tell you why I didn't come clean in that moment. Maybe it was my pride or the fact that my manhood was at stake, but either way, I cracked open another beer and set to helping him set up the tent. Connor and Hunter followed suit. Before long, the laughing and goading started back up. We collected firewood and told ghost stories, and when the time came, we crawled into our respective tents and went to sleep. I'd have totally taken that L if not for the sudden crunch of leaves that woke me well into the night. It only happened once, and yet I sat up, paralyzed with a sudden feeling of being preyed upon. And I felt like a rabbit in a trap, powerless to escape the clutches of whatever was sitting outside my tent. I tried to tell myself that a forest was filled to bursting with all manner of creatures, but the silence from earlier had made it clear that there were few, if not no animals living in these lands. And now, I sat in my nylon prison, holding my breath. I wondered if they'd simply had the good sense to do what I hadn't had the balls to do myself, or had they been trapped, toyed with, preyed upon. A snapping of leaves was just that. I tried, in vain, to calm myself. There was no sense in working myself up over a bunch of crunching leaves. Maybe a few squirrels hadn't gotten the memo, and they were up for a late-night snack. Maybe there was a bear around, minding his own business somewhere deep in the woods. There were thousands of fallen trees this close to fall. Yet, I still didn't stop holding my breath. I waited quietly as the sound of nails of nylon scratched at the back of the tent, slowly and methodically. The sound seeped into the skin until it felt as if the thing were etching runes into my bones. And it continued well into the night, until all I could do was not to cry. Those feelings of helplessness were pounding into me, nearly overwhelming my sense and my dignity as I sat with my hand over my mouth and my eyes shut. It was not possible to pretend it was a dream. It was nonsensical. It was silly to pretend this was an animal. An animal would have either gotten in or gotten bored, which could only mean there was something on the other side of my tent. I didn't know if it was a lunatic or a maniac, but I sat stock still either way, especially since it seemed to be content to torment me. The giggling that followed was proof enough of that. As the sun rose, the scratching slowed, but I didn't move until the heavy feeling was completely gone. Whoever had been out there seemed to have finally got bored. Shaken and raw, I clambered out of my tent, ready to tell anybody that we were leaving. But now, the words had died on my lips. The space where their tents had been was now completely empty. There was no trace of them. Only 2 lone beer cans sat at my place of the fire, 1 pair of shoes outside my tent, as if they'd never been there at all. My investigation yielded nothing by the way of evidence of my sanity, however. I did happen to look back at my tent, and I made the executive decision to abandon it there, sprinting away. In blood, there was a simple sentence fused in the fabric. Be glad you stayed inside. I am a very zen person. I like to be in contact with my own inner self and the nature that surrounds me. It helps me unwind from work stress and feel more like myself. Therefore, I decided, why not try something different this time? Give a solo camping trip a try. Never doing that again. I spent a day in the woods, right on the outskirts of Bonn, Germany. The scenery there was incredible. Autumn leaves were strewn all around, and the weather, though somewhat chilly, was still nice to spend outside. The day was actually fairly normal. I set up my tent before it got dark, and at night, I got inside, slept, hoping to wake up for a light jog early the next morning. I woke up the next day, looked outside the tent, stretched a little, headed for my jog. But there was something weird going on. The forest was silent, like eerily silent. No birds singing, no wind howling, nothing. Just my footsteps on the ground. I figured it was all in my head and decided to listen to some music to try and distract myself. I popped my headphones on. They weren't working. Strange. I would swear they had a full charge. I was forced to continue without music. So I quickened my pace and beginning to feel a bit unnerved. As I did, I realized the forest was beginning to change. I was arriving to a patch where all trees seemed to have lost their leaves. Not unusual this time of year, but it sure looked weird that just suddenly all trees in front of me were bare. I ignored it. I kept on jogging, almost sprinting now. I noticed I had no idea where I was headed. I looked back. All the paths were the same. Now I was completely disoriented. I kept on jogging, just guessing my way through, trying to get to a more familiar spot. All the time with this nagging feeling that something was wrong, and not a single sound beyond my breath and my footsteps. At one point, I reached a path I swear I had crossed 2 times already, and stopped. I wanted to get out there as fast as possible, and if anything, running blindly was just making me go in circles. I'd rather just try to use Google Maps. Surprise! I pull up my phone. No service. This never happens in Germany. I was weirded out. Either I was incredibly lost, or something was very wrong with my phone. Either way, I didn't like it, and was starting to get more and more nervous. I leaned against a tree, thinking about what to do. I had no idea which way I came from. All paths looked the same. I was not going to call the police. I wouldn't even know how to explain where I am. Besides, it seemed a bit excessive. Yet, I felt awful. It felt like the trees had eyes, and all of them were fixated right on me. I decided I'd try and walk outside the path and among the trees to see if I could find where my tent was. And so when I did, it was horrible. I felt dizzy right away, as if the trees were releasing a very strong aroma, making my head spin. But yet, I didn't smell anything. It just felt that way. I quickened my pace, trying to make it through. I soon lost all my sense of direction. I was dizzy, disoriented, and terrified. Going and going among the bare trees that all looked the same, trying to find my way out. Exhausted and feeling like I was about to vomit, I rested against a tree, heaving, and I heard it. a shrilling, high-pitched note piercing the silence, startling me and almost making me collapse. Another one followed after it, and then another. It was dissonant, a shrieking melody that sounded like it came from some sort of flute. I covered my ears, trying to find the source of this noise. A figure approached from a nearby path. It seemed like a woman. It was wearing rags that barely clung to her body, and her hair was a tangled mess from where the twigs and leaves protruded. She was holding something to her lips. I hid against a tree. Something told me she wouldn't be happy to see me, and as she walked closer, I gave another peek. She was holding what seemed like a stone-carved flute to her lips, and was making those shrilling noises into what she seemed to consider a melody. Her presence was inhuman. I don't know how to describe it. It's like what you feel when you see an animal try to speak. It seemed not natural. But what truly chilled me to the bone, I swear, she had no eyes. When she stopped her melody, I never felt more deeply observed in my life. The silence was deafening, and I knew she knew I was there. Yet I wouldn't dare come out. Then, she played her flute one last piercing note, and I passed out. I woke up in the forest. My forest. The one I'd spent the night on. It was dark, but I could tell it was back to normal. The trees still had some leaves on them. The sounds of the forest were back, and I looked back, saw my tent, and a few steps away, where I was lying, I looked at my phone. It was midnight. I'd spent the entire afternoon there. I got up, packed and went home, exhausted and willing to sleep with all my lights on. I still wonder if this was some sort of dream. Maybe I just passed out. But something inside of me tells me it was not. I shall never know what she was, nor do I want to. She felt ancient, like a force of nature. If German folklore has taught me something, is that there are things you should just let be. That was the nightmare and the last time I will ever go camping. Not my story, but my mom's, actually. And she had told me about the time she had encountered a strange creature when she went camping with all of her friends. One day, my mom and her friends had gone out camping. They spent the whole day out doing stuff that you would do in the natural outdoors, from swimming to hiking. But at night, my mom and her friends were sleeping in their tents, and my mom heard the sound of footsteps. She thought it might be one of her friends trying to scare her, because she was deathly afraid of the dark. She zipped open her tent to go out and tell her friends to knock it off, and she sees this man in a bright green suit, black slicked back hair, and a pale white face, almost looking like a corpse. This scared my mom so bad, she screamed at the top of her lungs, waking up all of her friends. When her friends started coming out, because of her scream, the man just vanished in thin air, like he was never there. Since my mom was so scared, she couldn't speak for the rest of the night. She was locked up in terror. After she calmed down a little, she explained what had happened. One of her friends claimed it was a demon that was haunting her, taking up form as her deceased uncle, who loved to wear green. But that's just her speculation. My mom has no reason to lie about this, ever. It is one of the scariest things that she's ever seen in her life, and her only run-in with the paranormal. I don't know if this counts as a paranormal story, but I've been really wanting to share it. Maybe somebody can give me some kind of explanation for this weird occurrence, or maybe share their story with me. Last year, I went on a short camping trip with my father and younger brother. We planned on going fishing during the day, and playing games around the fire in the evening. We had done this a couple of times before, so my brother and I felt very comfortable camping. I really looked forward to these trips. On the very first day that we set up our camp early in the morning, deciding to go out fishing. After just a couple of hours, we then decided to go back to our camping site. My dad always wanted to get back before it got dark out, to avoid getting lost or getting hurt. When we got back that day, all of our food and equipment was spread all across the campsite. It was everywhere, like it was thrown around. On top of that, our tent was now ruined. It looked like somebody had disassembled the tent, throwing it onto the ground. The three of us were really confused with the situation. My father asked to check if any of our stuff was gone. Nothing seemed to be missing, and there were no clues as to what or who had messed with our stuff. This absolutely didn't look like something that could have been done by any animal. If that was the case, at least some of our food would have been half-eaten, or even gone. Animals can't disassemble a tent, obviously. My father doesn't get scared easily, but it was clear that he was very uncomfortable and did not really know what to do. My brother and I were terrified. We always went back to that same spot and had never seen or heard of anybody nearby. We left that evening. We all agreed that we did not feel safe enough to stay that night. In some way, it felt like it was a warning. Maybe somebody who lived a bit further away did not want us there. It just didn't make sense at all that somebody would just ask us to leave if we were bothering them, or leave a note at the very least. We would have left without any problems. We don't like to be in people's way. The aggression was so unnecessary and unsettling. We found a different spot to go fishing this year, much closer to home. We did not want to test our luck. I can only advise people to really check your surroundings before setting up a campsite. Make sure you're not bothering others and staying safe. Also, don't forget to tell people back home where you are located, in case of an emergency. I was looking through my childhood pictures just a few days ago, and I found one from a place I never wanted to step foot in again. I was 14. My friends and I were sent to summer camp for a couple of days. Our parents thought they needed to unite kids with nature kind of crap. So they took all our devices before they sent us. Our camp counselor was my mom's friend, which is why she let me go so willingly. I think we were staying there for a week, or were supposed to anyway. Our camping was cut short, and we were back home within 2 days. The first day, the camp counselor, we'll call her Ellie, introduced herself, gave us a small tour of the camping site. She handed us a brochure for the camping program and other daily activities. I don't know what was so exciting about being in a dense forest, but whatever. At least my friends were there with me. We'll call them Brian and Tommy. Besides, I thought I might as well try to enjoy it, since we were already there. The first day, we had an early morning run at 7 a.m. I still remember it was hard waking up that early. After that, we had breakfast. We had to pick out herbs from the forest and help use them from the stew that made it for everyone. It was surprisingly edible. Brian almost picked up a poisonous root before Ellie stopped him. Next, she told us about the hiking plan. We began the hike and walked a few miles up when we saw a small, abandoned, run-down cabin. The kind with moss and vines growing all over it. There was a single door, no window. It was very eerie feeling. Tommy and I wanted to sneak inside and check it out. Ellie specifically told us not to go in there. That cabin was quite old, abandoned, and looked like it could collapse any time. Not sure if she meant it just to scare us, or if it was true. Anyhow, it worked. We followed the group for the rest of the trail. We walked a bit more before deciding to stop and set camp again for the night there. The next activity on the list was, and I quote, Marsha stories. They freaking made a word from marshmallows and stories. It was so cringy and funny. It started with Ellie getting us to set up a campfire, and then we roasted marshmallows over it, while one by one, we began sharing our favorite childhood memories for bonding purposes. So much for bonding when someone you're supposed to be spending just a week with. Anyway, it was lit. We took a group photo while we were sitting around the fire, and before we knew it, it began getting dark. We set up our tents, and Tommy and I ended up sharing one together. Brian got paired with another kid. I think we fell asleep sometime around 10. I think that's a record for my earliest bedtime ever, since I'm a pretty crazy night owl. The next moment that I opened my eyes, I don't remember what time it was, but what I saw and heard woke me up completely. It was not our tent. The room was dimly lit by candles placed around us in a circle. There was a strong stench in the room that made me nauseous. My hand felt wet, and I looked at it to see it was stained red, like paint. Only the smell told me it wasn't paint. I noticed a circle drawn around us and weird lines in from it, from the same blood. I began to panic. Then it got worse, and I felt movement around. I lifted my head and saw people standing in a circle around me. They had worn dark robes that covered their heads, and in the dark, I could not make out their faces at all. They were whispering something. It almost sounded like a chant, but it was not in English. They had their hands joined together like they were praying. It scared me. One of them, the one standing right in front of me at a distance, had something in his hands. It wasn't until he raised his hand did I realize it's a sacrificial knife. Without tearing my eyes off of him, I shook Tommy violently to wake him up, but he was unconscious. I could feel my heart in my throat. The man with a knife in his hand began to move toward me, targeting me. I was frozen on the spot. I could not move an inch. He said something like I'd be a healthy sacrifice for their cause, how they hoped to be blessed. This was something out of a cult movie, but it was real. That did it for me. I was yelling and screaming at the top of my lungs as loud as I could. I could hardly recognize my own voice as I cried. The man kept getting closer, but I closed my eyes and just kept hearing screaming. I don't know what happened next. Everything blacked out. I opened my eyes to find Ellie and an officer looming over me. It was now daytime. I was back in my tent. They told me that Tommy and I had disappeared from our tents when Ellie came to check on everybody, shortly after midnight. Soon after, Ellie heard my yelling, and she ran over with the other camp guides in the direction of the sound. It was coming from that abandoned cabin that we had passed by earlier on our trail. As soon as Ellie reached there, she saw me, and Tommy unconscious inside the room with candles blown out inside, the same blood-drawn circles. There was no one else there. Ellie called the cops and the campground guards. They searched and scoured, but there was no trace of anybody else ever being there, other than our group. Tommy was unconscious the entire time. He had no idea. The only one who remembered what had happened was me. Nobody could explain what had happened. The cops tried looking for clues and leads, but they didn't find anything, except for that blood that was of a lamb's, and that it was most definitely a well-known cult in the area. Guess I was lucky enough to not have been sacrificed to whoever they were worshipping. The year was 2018. My office colleagues and I worked on a long project, so as a gift, we decided to go camping and hiking. There were 6 of us. We booked a car and went driving up to the foothill. A lake was adjacent to hill ground, so after the long drive, we decided to rest and then start hiking early in the morning. My friend Josh and Alan tied up 3-tent house in a circular manner with fire in the middle. We fished out a couple of fishes, and it officially began to get dark. The line of trees behind the lake gave the illusion of the forest, of it looking dense. Our dinner was instant noodles with fish and soup, and as time went by, we went inside our tent to get some rest. My tent partner for the night was Melissa. We scooched into our respective sleeping bags, and Melissa slept to my right and went to sleep almost immediately. Late in the middle of the night, I felt cold and opened my eyes. but when I flipped to Melissa's side, she wasn't there. Tent's zipper door was open, and she was there standing in front of it with her back to the tent door. Out of curiosity, I called to her twice, but she did not respond. I unzipped my sleeping bag, and there was sheer silence. No sound except insects and wind. I stood up again and called out her name. She hurriedly looked back at me, frightened and scared, and comforting her, I patted her shoulder. It was ice cold. I tucked her inside the sleeping bag and went to sleep myself, worrying about her and hoping she was okay. Early morning, we got ready for our mountain hike. I did not ask Melissa anything about the night before until afternoon sun hit us and we took a break. I asked her why she got up late at night. She said something about hearing voices, but as far as we know, there was nobody else there but us. The topic left unsolved and we headed up again. When sun began descending, we decided to set up our tents a second time in a different location. From morning, I was observing Melissa, and she was not quite with us as she kept looking back. I was agitated at this point, so I asked her what was with her in my strong voice. She told me that she had a feeling about somebody following us the whole time. However, there was no one behind us. As Grandma's story time was over, we went to our respective tents. Josh went into the woods with the guys for Nature's Call, and they did not return for like 20 minutes. I tried calling them, but the network was poor out here. I did receive signal from our walkie-talkie. It was Richie. He asked everybody to return fast, saying there was something big roaming around. Hearing this got everybody riled up and scared. After everybody returned to the camp, we put out the fire and jumped in the tent, hiding for safety. A lot of time had passed, but we didn't see anything. Right when Alan got up to go out, we could hear this groan. We stopped him, turning off our lights, and sat there, frightened. At first, we thought it might be something big like a bear. And suddenly, the groaning began increasing as it was coming towards our camp. We could hear something beating on the ground, like a heavy thudding. And now, our heartbeats were so loud like a conjoined chorus. We were scared that this thing or animal would hear it. We were powerless. We had no weapons, only safety in numbers. Josh looked through the small hole in the tent, and it appeared to be a bear-like animal, but maybe that's not what it was. It was strange looking. Its body was lean and its hands were touching the ground, but the proportions were not that of a bear. No, it definitely was not a bear. Melissa went numb and cold as a sculpture. I could hear this thing's footsteps around our tent, walking upright. Having no choice left, we needed to be extremely silent for the sake of our livelihood. We tried calling the police while this was going on, but no signal. Then came the moment where it stood in front of our tent door. It felt like the ground itself was thundering. We were so scared. Everything felt like a nightmare, taking far too long to end. After a while, everything went quiet and we thought it was gone. We eventually got brave enough to step out and felt a sense of partial relief, but we were not all safe. Maybe it was the fish's smell that brought it here, or our blood. I don't know. I may be saying anything right now because the thoughts, when they come back to me, terrify me. I can say that that night, we slept in shifts. Somebody was always guarding the surroundings. Before dawn, we left without completing our hike. No one was in his or her correct state of mind. Everybody was cautious and paranoid. Nobody was willing to talk about what had happened last night. We were all equally frightened. After the long descent down the hill to the straightaway, we got back to our car and decided to leave it from there. As we began our drive home, maybe not even a few minutes, Josh mentioned something tailing our car. I looked in the rearview mirror and could see the shadow of a creature exactly like the one we saw last night, running. I immediately called Melissa, who was in the car ahead of us. Josh shouting, asking them to speed up. Because the creature was going to catch up to us, we had no idea what was about to happen. I never had a chance to take a clear look, but it looked completely unreal. After this, I kept having nightmares for a month, and a couple of my colleague friends behaved in strange ways. Melissa left after about a month after. It will still send shivers down my spine every time I think about it. Now, I never leave for a camping trip, and there's just so many unanswered questions in my head. This is a story of how me and my friends saw the fresco nightcrawler when we were camping out in California. It was the first week of our summer vacation, after our final exam, so to relax was wonderful. I needed to take a break. Me and my friends decided to go camping somewhere near the outskirts of our town, which will remain anonymous. After all, I can't have any cryptid hunters coming to me in my town. This was a popular site, and many people had told us how the scenery there was wonderful. We went in 2 cars, one for girls and one for boys. On the way to the campsite, we brought tons of food, loading up whenever we could at gas stations. We took pictures and had a great time. Upon reaching, we realized that all the good things and praises we had heard from others had been true. The trees were lush and everything was fantastic. The weather was perfect for this time of year, so we set up a wonderful fire at a considerable distance from the trees and set our tents up all around us. We began to laugh and drink and talk about anything and everything except for school and exams. It was so much finally getting a break from all that stress. Then, after sunset, we decided to make s'mores and share horror stories. There's nothing more fun than scaring each other. We shared stories about ghosts, demons, and all the supernatural stuff that has happened to us growing up. We didn't realize that it was now about 2 to 3 in the morning. We thought of putting the fire out to not attract anyone or anything. After all, leaving a fire unattended is very unsafe. After putting the fire out, we decided to crawl into our tents. Suddenly, one of my friends said to look near the forest in a very shaky voice. When we looked behind, there was this alien-like creature, maybe 7 to 8 feet tall. It was long and white, toothpick-like, actually. Very small legs and huge deer antlers on its head. I didn't know whether the creature was smiling or snarling, but its long pointy teeth were showing, and it had these almost bioluminescent eyes glowing. After a few moments of staring at each other, it came barreling towards us. Quickly acting, one of the girls crouched down right by the fire and grabbed a piece of log that was mostly on fire and chucked it at this creature's direction. The creature darted out of the way and disappeared. Now we were terrified. With thudding hearts, we looked at each other, all of us equally scared and now pale at what this assailant could do. It was silent. We realized we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Our camping trip had been canceled. We packed up our stuff as quickly as we could, throwing it in the cars and driving back towards town. We were constantly looking back to see if it followed us. To keep from encountering any such things again, we kept our high beams on. I told my parents what had happened. They got angry at us for staying out there and not sleeping in our tents. They didn't even believe that we saw this thing. Instead, they accused us of doing acid and drinking, which is why we saw it. When I searched online, the creature that fits that description, I learned was what we saw was a fresco nightcrawler. I know other people have supposedly witnessed it, but I'm not so sure. It was on a hot summer night that I was out in the dark woods with my neighbor, whom I'm pretty close with. He was like extended family, honestly. The fact that I didn't even know we were going until that night when I was sitting at home in front of my laptop, playing video games. My neighbor came over to see me, and he asked me if I wanted to go camping with him and his family. It had been a while since we last did anything together, so of course I said yes. It would have just given us an excuse not to go to school for a couple of days. This was in September, so school had just started back up, and the coldness of fall had not yet come, so it was perfect. The next day, his family and I gathered our camping gear. We're driving down a dark road with tall trees on either side of it. It was getting dark quickly, so we had to turn the lights on, and unfortunately, which means we would have had to set up in the dark. So we're driving for about an hour or two, but it felt like it took forever. My friend's dad turned left at an unmarked intersection, where there wasn't even a sign saying that this was the right turnoff. The road got bumpy and rocky as he drove over this very raw, unpaved road. That's when we came across a large clearing, because all I could see around me was trees and darkness, where we stopped at this makeshift campground. I say that because there was no clear indicated spot to set up a tent, a spigot, a bathroom, or anything. This was truly camping just out in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. Now, I need to say that it was pitch black out, and it had gotten really cold now that the sun had set. We were also higher up in elevation, so we got everything set up quickly and decided we would huddle up in the tent together that my friend's father had set up for us. But I just had this feeling lingering within me that we weren't alone. Now, my brain was playing tricks on me, so I decided to step out and get some fresh air. It was eerily quiet until I heard this screaming noise. My heart began pounding fast, as if it knew what was coming. Then we heard a rustling noise in the bushes, more screaming from the woods. I was so scared that my friend told me to come back into the tent now. Not only could we all hear the noises, but then, as I got back in the tent and we shined our light, we could see something moving outside the tent. This shape. My friend's dad got a flashlight, shining it too at this object. That's when this thing began screaming and thrashing. Now we're all yelling, freaking out because we can see the shape of this thing more. It looked like an animal, but all we could see was this large shape, and it was terrifying looking. From the silhouette, it looked like an upright, deformed reindeer or something, and it had long claws. Were we being pranked? I wasn't even sure. It screamed again in our direction, and we just prayed for it to leave. It walked around our tent, and we all kept our flashlights shining at it through the tent material, only revealing its silhouette. But one thing I noticed is it never came closer to the tent. It's like it was pissed that we set up camp here in its area. I get it. This probably sounds like some sort of amateur creepypasta, but tell that to my family, my friend's family, and me, who have to deal with the memory of this thing. We stopped hearing it, almost literally, after we all pretty much urinated all over our sleeping bags out of terror. Surprisingly, none of us had any weapons on us. Somehow we all forgot. We got lucky that night, but who knows what would have happened if it were to come back, and possibly check out our tent. Now, of course, my friend's dad regrets that he didn't bring any weapons. He forgot. He normally always carries a pistol. I went home the next day, and we didn't get any sleep that night. What was designed to be a several-day trip turned into a quick overnight terror. I've not been able to go camping since. I don't think I ever will. And I'm also not sure what this thing was or where it came out of. I haven't really sat down to try and research either. I don't really care. I just want to get rid of this memory. I had been working as a forest ranger for almost 5 years. A ranger's day could consist of anything from collecting firewood to tracking down missing hikers. And my day began like most. I would wake up early, walking into work, grabbing my binoculars. As I was about to drive out of the forest, I got a call. That day, I was given a new assignment. I met up with another colleague, a fellow ranger, and we went to the center of this area where somebody had been reporting hearing strange screaming coming from around a cave system nearby. My partner and me decided that I would be able to handle it by myself. He had other things to do, and this was just another run-of-the-mill investigation for me. After he left, I headed towards that area where there had been several unreported mounds to this cave system. Now, let me give you some information. This cave system runs pretty deep, and there are guided tours, but I also know that this cave system is very expansive, and also having a lot of unidentified entrances and holes that can lead deeper into the system. These are also off trail, so myself, I've never actually experienced finding more of these, although I know hikers have reported finding many, and even leaving makeshift markers to let other hikers know this was an entrance. Parts of the ground here were also dangerous, meaning if you step on the wrong part, the ground below you could collapse, falling into a tunnel. So I had to be very careful about how I approached this entire search. The good news is, I wasn't hearing any screaming, so that could be good or bad news. The bad news meaning the hiker or whoever was stuck there could have been deceased or what. But the good news being that maybe the hiker had gotten themselves out. Anyway, my heart was pounding just by the sheer adrenaline of it. I didn't know why, but something told me to run. It was this feeling in the pit of my gut. As soon as I got there, right around the cavern system, the wind picked up, and everything seemed colder than it already was. A gust. Now, I could have begun my investigation in the main entrance, but as I was planning, I heard the scream. It sounded like a person, but they were maybe a couple 100 feet away, north. So I marched through the trees, looking, following the source of the screaming, yelling out, "Can you hear me? Can you respond?" And the screaming ceased. I followed along the rock wall and found this crude hole in the ground, maybe no larger than 5 feet. It was right by a rotted tree stump with only one branch on it. This, I knew, probably went down into one of the cave systems. This, by the way, was probably no more than 200 feet away from the main entrance. After crouching down, I was able to slide down at a 45-degree angle into this cave system, landing in a small chamber that I think connected to the others. I always carry a flashlight with me, so I took it out and turned it on. As soon as I did that, the caves plunged into darkness as my battery instantly died. That's when I heard a loud crash. I turned around, or I should say, turned to meet the noise, and my flashlight popped back on. There, like out of some sort of sick Stephen King novel, was this grotesque figure, large black eyes covering its entire body, stretching its arms out and moving toward me. And terrified, I wanted to turn and run, but didn't have time, as there was another one of these beings coming from the opposite side of the cave, approaching. I turned as fast as I could and fled up the 45-degree incline about the cave. Just as I was turning to climb up, I could hear a third one approaching from directly behind me. Now I had one coming from my left, my right, and behind me. This one, as I turned and looked, was larger than the other two. Completely terrified out of my mind, and the sounds of screaming were now apparent, coming deeper in the cavern. I don't know if it was an injured hiker, or if these things were making the noise, luring anybody into this tiny crevice, this chamber into the earth. Like I said, the opening to this cavern wasn't large, but I never in a million years would have expected to find things like this. This was horror movie status. I didn't tell anybody else about what I found, and kept it to myself. After climbing out of that hole, I ran, and I ran, and I ran some more. Getting back to the station later on, I didn't say a word. I knew the other rangers wouldn't believe me. And what would I tell them? That I found a cave full of half arachnids, half creatures? I mean, they'd probably think I was crazy. Now, I've kept this secret for a while, but how long can I keep it from the rest of the world? Will my story ever be told to other people? Or should I just stay quiet about what had happened? Let me just apologize and say, I'm sorry for the formatting of this story. I'm a terrible writer, and I am not a storyteller, so I'd apologize in advance. But these creatures that I saw were unlike anything I've ever seen. They really reminded me if you crossed a tarantula with a human. I mean, these were gross. They made this hissing, clicking noise too. I know it sounds phony through email, but it's really hard for me to convey emotion properly, at least through written communication. With all the information coming out anymore about missing hikers and seeing strange figures and shapes in the woods, and all the other bizarre happenings of 2020, I figured, hey, maybe now is an okay time to be open about my experiences and hopefully not experience backlash. I was patrolling my usual forest trails at night. I've been a ranger for 8 years now, and nothing had ever scared me as much as this one experience that I encountered, well, what I think was a Bigfoot, doing my routine patrol on this night. It all started with me, walking along the same trail I do at night to do my rounds. Being Florida, it had rained earlier in the day, so everything was calm and peaceful, minus the puddles of mud here and there. The sun had set about an hour or two before, which meant it was exceptionally dark outside, although I was already used to this. The moon was barely out. I saw a few other rangers patrolling with me, but they had passed by, and somewhere out of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes later, I was walking along the dirt trail when I noticed something appeared in front of me. A dark, large figure coming from the right side of the path and then crossing in front of me as it headed off into some thick brush off to my left. Palmettos, actually. This is directly where I patrol, meaning there should most definitely not be anything even remotely close to resembling whatever this thing was. Its speed is what surprised me and took me off guard, considering it didn't even give me enough time to turn around and see what it looked like. All I could make out was that it was jet black, very tall, and easily taller than I was. It moved quickly. I didn't even have time to react until after it had already gone into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, deep in the palmettos. My heart sunk, and I felt an odd sensation. It was this incredible feeling of fear. All I can think about is how much more dangerous it had just made my job that night. If there was some large animal out here that moved fast, was taller than I and larger than I, that actually crossed paths with me like it did, what else might be lurking out here? Would it cross paths with me again? Was this thing actually looking for me? As I thought about it more, I considered the fact that if something was after me, then maybe whatever it was might be prepared to attack. Although, I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I began getting angry. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But I was a few hours away from my shift ending, and talking myself into returning to the station, telling myself that if I did, I would be safe. If this thing is out there, it's just as much looking for me as it is anybody else. So now more than ever, getting to my ranger station was my only priority. I didn't really know what it was or what to think about it, but there was only one way to find out, and that was by continuing my patrol. Now I stood still for a moment, debating with myself on whether or not I should continue, remembering all the times going back home early had made me feel like a failure. Although I had never encountered anything like this before, it didn't mean there was nothing out there. It only means that whatever it was hadn't bothered me yet. But now that it had crossed paths with me, I might be next on this list of things to kill. That would have made me sick. The rest of my story is pretty uneventful. Unfortunately, after this, not a lot happened. I didn't see the figure again, and as I look back on this event and reflect, I believe I encountered a skunk ape, a Bigfoot, native to the Florida Everglades. While it was probably harmless and didn't want to actually hurt or kill me, it was still completely terrifying. I still don't know if this creature was real or not, but that didn't matter, regardless of what it actually is. I'm convinced that whatever it was, it wanted to hurt me, or so I had convinced myself, and still wonder. I honestly don't know how to explain what had happened to me. I believe I saw some sort of Native American entity. I was working as a ranger for the city of Austin, Texas. I just had one left of our reserve campsites when a very strange thing occurred. This was about 10:30 at night. I was driving my four-wheel drive pickup truck on a dirt road that led back to the entrance of the park. The area is a wooded hillside spanning 200 acres and contains a very large number of wildlife. So, being nighttime and how many animals are nocturnal, I was watching out for signs of their movement on either side of me. It was quiet, and I was the only one around. I had been following the road closely when I got this strong sensation. The road, everything around it, dense woods. I looked up just as a deer ran out in front of my truck, directly in my path. It was something like 40 yards ahead of me. When I saw it, I reacted immediately by pulling onto the shoulder, slamming my brakes. The deer now was only about 10 feet away from my truck when I swerved and it vanished. As soon as it went out of sight, the feeling that had told me to look up subsided. Everything went back to normal. There were no other cars on the road. Of course, being just mine, I sat in place, trying to collect my bearings. My heart was beating fast and I had a headache, and I couldn't explain these feelings. What on earth? So something brought my attention to the hillside, right where the deer had come from, and that's when I saw movement, about 50 yards into the brush. It wasn't clear. I got out of my truck to inspect and walked up to the spot where I thought I had seen the movement through the tree line. The woods were pretty thick, but about 20 feet into them, there was a small opening and trees with lower branches and ones that were not as wide or tall. They almost kind of formed a natural corridor that maybe, I'd say, 50 yards opened up to the hillside before becoming obscured by the other trees and foliage. The ground sloped slightly upward, many leaves. I called out with my flashlight, thinking, why would there be somebody out here? It didn't make any sense. Thinking maybe I was just seeing things, or it might be another deer. There was no answer, and that was it. I assumed it was just my own paranoia. Now, I didn't hear anything move past me, so I decided to inspect further, because why not? Calling out loudly, I knew, at least I'm pretty sure, I saw movement. And again, there should be no reason at all why anybody should be this far out here late at night. The movement I saw was more like a person, not a deer. At least I'm sure of it. So I kind of very shortly walked up the hillside, never hearing a sound. I decided finally that okay, enough is enough. I'm gonna leave and head back to my truck. As soon as I got in, I realized there was something wrong. Something strange and paranormal, if you will. As soon as I got back in my truck is when I saw it. Coming out of the woods ahead of me, slightly up from where the deer emerged, is what I can only unmistakably describe as an apparition. It was this glowing, translucent being, but unmistakably a spirit. It shimmered, seeming to be faint, but nearly transparent. It came closer to my truck and appeared as if it were getting bigger, but also darker and more solid at the same time. It was this light grayish color and then would grow darker in color, kind of pulsating. It just walked right past the front of my truck, with no fear or concern about my presence whatsoever. It just walked by like nothing was there, with some kind of purposeful stride, without having so much as even a look of curiosity. And then, right there in my view, just vanished, fading into obscurity. Not wasting a second, I flew my vehicle out of there, and my only mission in that moment was to go, 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 go. Before this, I thought ghosts were a joke. I had never been a believer in the paranormal, or what many refer to as the spirit realm. But after this, that changed my mind. And I'll never forget what I saw, but it wasn't until the following morning when I really kind of fully mentally processed what I saw. Surprisingly, because I didn't sleep that much. But a thought occurred to me, and I realized what had really happened. What I saw looked like a stereotypical image of a native. Long hair down to its shoulders, feathers, a headdress actually. My professional theory is that somebody, a Native American, has gone through this road many times before in their lifetime, and they're simply showing me something that happened here at some point along the way. Maybe they stumbled upon these woods at night, and for whatever reason, they were killed on spot by first contact European settlers, who probably had no qualms about killing anybody different than them, including women and children. I do not believe this entity or spirit to have been malicious. It didn't come off as that. It was just something that happened to them in their lifetime. This spirit was merely doing whatever some non-physical thing does when in the process of trying to relive what happened. It's a possibility that this spot is where these people might have killed or injured in an altercation. Maybe they were stuck between this world and the next. I don't know. Maybe they've seen my truck hundreds of times out here late at night over the years, and now I'm able to pick up on whatever it happens to come through here. Who knows? Anyway, that's my experience with the paranormal. Hopefully, it will be my last.